Okay, so this morning I'm talking about, I've got a talk entitled Christian Influence in 20th Century Alberta. So mostly what I'll be talking about is two premiers in the middle of the 20th century. One was William Aberhart, his nickname was Bible Bill Aberhart, and the other was Ernest Manning. So between the two of them, they were premiers from 1935 until 1968. Like Aberhart became premier in 1935 and he died in 1943, and he was replaced by Ernest Manning, who resigned as premier in 1968. Now, it's very interesting that both Aberhart and Manning referred to themselves as Christian fundamentalists. So Alberta had Christian fundamentalist premiers for over 30 years. I just want to comment on the word fundamentalist. Like these days, the term fundamentalist is a derogatory term used to mean an extremist. But early on, a fundamentalist was just a person who believed in the fundamentals of Christianity. So as these men referred to themselves as fundamentalists in the mid 20th century, it didn't have quite the derogatory concept to it that it does today. So I will use that term fundamentalist. I'm not using it in a derogatory way. These were people who believed firmly in the Bible, and they were premiers of Alberta. So I'm focusing mostly on those two men. If there's time at the end, I want to discuss some other important Christians who were influential in Alberta. Like mostly I'm referring to political influence in Alberta, maybe a little bit cultural and religious influence as well. So we'll begin with William Aberhart. So William Aberhart was actually born in Ontario in 1878, and during his high school years, he had a conversion experience and became, a fundamentalist Christian. He was influenced a lot by some of the Christian leaders of that time, D.L. Moody and C.I. Schofield in particular. So Aberhart was very interested in studying the Bible from a dispensationalist perspective. A dispensationalist Bible prophecy was kind of his expertise. Now, as a young man, he became a school teacher, and he rapidly progressed in his career because he was very good at that. So by 1910, he had become principal of Brantford's Central Public School. A few years later, the Calgary Public School Board lured him to Alberta. They saw how good he was, and they offered him a good salary to move to Alberta to become a principal in Calgary. And by 1915, he was the principal of Crescent Heights High School, which is kind of a prominent school at that time in Calgary. So he was well known in his career as a public school principal, like very well known and respected that way. But outside of his career, he was also known as a Bible study leader and teacher. He became very well known that way. And in 1918, he ended up joining the Westbourne Baptist Church in Calgary, which was a very small fundamentalist congregation in Calgary, but it didn't remain small because Aberhart's Bible studies were so popular that people from around the city flocked to hear him speak, to lead his Bible studies for Westbourne Baptist Church. Eventually, he had to rent the Palace Theatre in Calgary because so many people were coming to his Bible studies. And by 1925, he would get an audience of 2,500 people at his Bible studies at the Palace Theatre. So this is at a time when Calgary, its population, I couldn't get the exact number, but it was somewhere around 80,000, somewhere in that vicinity. And he was having 2,500 people come to his Bible studies on Sundays. So he was encouraged to take his Bible studies onto the radio. And so he started a radio program late in 1925 on the CFCN radio station in Calgary, which was the most powerful radio station in Western Canada. And his radio program was an instant success. So people all over Alberta and actually in the western part of Saskatchewan and eastern part of BC, could hear Aberhart's Bible studies for 2 hours. It was a 2-hour radio program every Sunday afternoon. And back in those days, of course, Alberta was very rural, and a lot of people didn't have easy access to churches. So it became a very common thing for many families in Alberta to gather around their radio on Sunday afternoons and listen to William Aberhart's radio program. So within a short time, he had a listening audience of over 350,000 people. Now that's significant because Alberta's population at the time was about 700,000. So like I said, some of the listeners would be in Saskatchewan and BC, but he had close to half of Alberta's population as his regular radio audience. So it was, according to CFCN, that was the largest radio following of any religious broadcast in Canada. And of course, we have to remember, like radio was a very significant technology at that time. That was before television and other communications technologies. And so radio was a relatively new technology, and the idea of using it for religious broadcasting was a relatively new idea. So Aberhart was a pioneer in that area. And he, of course, got quite this wide following throughout Alberta, especially, and in other parts of Western Canada. So in 1927, Aberhart founded the Calgary Prophetic Bible Institute in Calgary. So he used the Prophetic Bible Institute for worship services on Sundays, for Bible studies, and for his radio broadcasts. Up to this point, he had never been involved in politics. But in 1929, the Great Depression began, and it was very hurtful for many people, especially on the prairies. And one of his former students committed suicide, and that affected Aberhart very drastically. And he really wanted to find some way of trying to fight against the depression. So in 1932, during the summer, he was in Edmonton marking exams, and there was another teacher there marking exams with him who was a proponent of social credit theory. And he asked Aberhart to read a book called Unemployment or War by Maurice Colborne, which is kind of an introductory a book that introduces people to the ideas of social credit. So Aberhart read that one night, and he was completely taken by it. He really believed that the social credit economic theory was a way to overcome the depression. And so he began using his radio program to promote the social credit theory in Alberta. He'd spend part of his program, with his religious broadcast, and part of his program to produce to promote the social credit economic ideas. Now, I should mention, social credit economic ideas are kind of confusing, and I can't explain it properly myself, but the basic idea behind it is that the government would control the amount of credit in the country rather than private banks. Like the way we have it now is you get credit from private banks, and Aberhart and others believed that the private banks were using that for their own financial benefit. They figured that if the government issued credit, they could do it for the benefit of all the people. So that's kind of a summary of the idea. But I just wanted to show here this book here by Christian economist Gary North. It's called Salvation Through Inflation. This is actually a whole book-length critique of social credit theory. And the reason that Gary North wrote this actually was because as a result of Aberhart adopting the social credit idea and promoting it so strongly, from that point forward, the idea social credit economic theory actually became popular in certain Christian circles. The person who invented social credit theory, who came up with it, was Major C.H. Douglas, an engineer in Britain. And he wasn't a Christian. He had nothing to do with Christianity. So there was no natural connection between social credit theory and Christianity. But because Aberhart was such a famous Bible teacher and he promoted social credit theory, the two ideas kind of became identified, so that many Christians adopted social credit theory. So Gary North wrote this whole book explaining why social credit theory is false. He talks about Aberhart in here and the Alberta experiment. I wanted people to know that because I'll be talking favorably of social credit and the impact it had in Alberta, but I'm talking about the political movement and not the economic theory itself, because the economic theory is not actually a Christian theory. It's not socialism because it believes in private property and the private ownership and control of business, but it does give the government a bigger role in terms of control of credit. So I just wanted to let people know that social credit theory is not the real economic theory from a biblical perspective, but some really good people bought into it, and it did develop it into a political movement that was very beneficial for Alberta in many respects. So, at that time with the Depression, many people were looking for a political solution. So when Aberhart started promoting social credit on his radio program, he was very respected. And so people bought into it in Alberta. And Aberhart ended up creating what he called the Douglas Social Credit League, which was an organization to promote social credit in Alberta. So he trained certain leaders and organizers who travel around the province, and they hold meetings like in community halls and schools and private homes to promote the social credit idea and to set up study groups so that people in their local communities would study social credit. So by 1935, there were 1,600 social credit study groups throughout Alberta, which was very significant. Now, at that time, the provincial government in Alberta was the United Farmers of Alberta. That was the provincial party that ran the government. And Aberhart went to them and promoted the social credit idea to them. He wanted United Farmers of Alberta to embrace the social credit concept and to implement it. But the United Farmers rejected that altogether. So Aberhart set up the Social Credit Party to contest the next election, the 1935 election. Now, he had a significant advantage in this election because he had this huge radio audience where he could promote his ideas. Also, he was already a very respected religious leader, and he had, some kind of special leadership qualities. Like there's certain people with a kind of a leadership charisma, and people bought into it, and really believed in him and were willing to adopt the social credit idea. And not only that, he was a very good public speaker. So during the 1935 provincial election campaign, the main other parties competing with him were United Farmers of Alberta, which was the government, and also the Liberal Party. And both of those parties were having trouble, attracting people to their political meetings. They would get very small turnouts. But wherever Aberhart had a meeting, there would be a huge turnout. And I just wanted to read a quote here from John Irving, who was a political scientist at the University of Toronto. He describes here the Aberhart meetings. Actually, it reminds me, if you think of like some of the Donald Trump meetings these days, he gets all these thousands of enthusiastic people to listen to him. And that's what I think of when I read this. So this is the 1935 election campaign. Wherever Aberhart appeared, the roads leading to that place would be jammed with traffic, all headed for the meeting place. The large audiences that always assembled would await his arrival with spontaneous expectancy. His appearance on the platform would be greeted with waves of thunderous applause. Even in small or remote villages like Sylvan Lake or Marwayne, there was no relaxation of the heightening tempo of his campaign. The people who flocked to his meetings, invariably overcrowded, wanted a good show, and they always got it. The great spellbinder never failed to lift his audiences to a state of hysterical enthusiasm. Now, that's a description from a political scientist who's not a proponent or a fan of Aberhart, but it's just he was different. Like, he had this special ability to, to make people want to hear him and listen to him. So in the provincial election on August 22nd, 1935, the Social Credit Party won a landslide victory, winning 56 of the 63 seats in the legislature with over 54% of the vote. So Aberhart that night, of course, he gave a victory speech at the Calgary Prophetic Bible Institute for winning the election. And I just want to read the concluding words of his victory speech. This is how he concluded his election. I want personally to give thanks to the Almighty God in heaven for his guidance and direction in this whole matter. I assure you that it is our intention to submit our deliberations to his divine guidance and wisdom. Since he seems to be calling us to a place of leadership, we trust that our people will put their trust in him and not fail. Follow your government with your prayers. Remember our theme song, O God, our help in ages past. So, imagine a politician giving a victory speech like that today. It just wouldn't happen, giving all praise and glory to God for his election victory. So this election victory of Social Credit was news around the world. Like, this was news in the United States and Britain and all kinds of other countries. Many of the news reports thought this was a great disaster for Alberta because they thought, the social credit theory was really wacky and it was going to fail. And other news reports were more favorable, but it was worldwide news. So what you have in the 3 short years, social credit went from an obscure economic theory to leading a provincial government in Alberta. And the credit has to go to Aberhart. It was Aberhart's leadership and his prominence that brought this obscure idea from nowhere to a provincial government in just 3 years. And also, I should mention, like, shortly thereafter, a federal social credit party was formed. And in October 15th, 1935, in the federal election, social credit won 15 out of 17 federal seats in Alberta. So social credit was a force, especially provincially, but also to some degree federally. It was a force provincially and also somewhat federally in Alberta. Now, the problem was that much of the social credit theory had to do with reforming the economic system, reforming the financial system, and that's federal level of government and not the provincial government. So the social credit government in Alberta would introduce legislation to reform the financial system, and it would be struck down by the federal government because it was outside of Alberta's jurisdiction. So it was a very controversial time, and Alberta was very much in conflict with the federal government over the implementation of the social credit theory. Now, in 1940, there was another provincial election, and Aberhart won that election again with a much reduced majority, and he died in 1943. But there's 2 major effects that Aberhart had during his time in Alberta. The first was his religious effect, and that is that he brought Christianity into the household of almost every Alberta family through his radio broadcasting. That was very significant, religious influence in Alberta. And also he changed, he created a new political reality in Alberta with the Social Credit Party. He completely changed the political atmosphere of the province, and the Social Credit Party would still be, the major political party in Alberta until the early 1970s, and it was the opposition party for a few years after that. So that was a major change in Alberta politically. Now, I just want to have a kind of a footnote here. Aberhart was kind of the dominant fundamentalist leader in Alberta at the time, but there was also another major fundamentalist leader in Alberta, and that was L.E. Maxwell. Prairie Bible Institute, he's associated with Bible Institute. Prairie Bible Institute was created in 1922 when J. Fergus Kirk, a Three Hills farmer, brought L.E. Maxwell from the United States to teach at this brand new Bible college, Prairie Bible Institute. And L.E. Maxwell was a very effective leader, a very effective preacher, and he became a very prominent religious personality in Alberta. So Maxwell and Aberhart were the 2 main fundamentalist leaders in Alberta, and they were friends. And so Maxwell even preached at the Calgary Prophetic Bible Institute. But they had a falling out when Aberhart adopted social credit and began promoting it. L.E. Maxwell and the people of Prairie Bible Institute were opposed to the social credit idea. They thought it was too socialistic, and they also thought it was wrong to use a religious platform to promote a political idea. But most of Alberta's fundamentalists supported Aberhart, and so when the Prairie Bible Institute people opposed Aberhart, they lost about 2/3 of their support. So their support, crashed. In 1938, though, their support began to build back because they brought a guy named Oscar Lowry, who was an evangelist associated with Moody Bible Institute. They brought him to Alberta and had him preach on the radio and do teaching that way. And that was a very effective. Oscar Lowry was very effective in his radio broadcasts. There were thousands of letters and responses in reply to that. That was 1938, and he came back in 1939. And Ellie Maxwell figured that the response to Oscar Lowry's preaching was actually kind of a mini revival within Alberta, because many people were converted and a lot of new evangelical churches were started in Alberta. So there was a very significant religious impact in Alberta because of the Prairie Bible Institute bringing Oscar Lowry to Alberta. So like as I mentioned, that was kind of like a mini revival, and it really affected Alberta in a good way that way with the spread of Christianity. Now, after Aberhart died, Ernest Manning took over as premier, and so the rift between Prairie Bible Institute and the social credit movement was healed by Ernest Manning. So Ernest Manning reached out to Prairie. They became very friendly afterwards. So from the time that Ernest Manning became premier, there was no longer divisions between the social credit people and the Prairie Bible Institute people. Now, Ernest Manning is actually one of the great legacies of Aberhart, because Ernest Manning was a farm boy from Saskatchewan. He was born in 1908, and in 1925, when Aberhart started broadcasting on the radio, Ernest Manning as a teenager would listen to Aberhart, and he was converted through Aberhart's ministry on the radio. So he became a Christian. Then in 1927, when the Calgary Prophetic Bible Institute began, Manning moved to Calgary to attend that Bible Institute, and he was actually the first graduate of the Calgary Prophetic Bible Institute. Manning was a very effective student, and Aberhart saw that Manning was superior, and he brought in Manning to be his assistant, in his ministry. So Manning was the right-hand man to Aberhart for his ministry. And then in 1935, with the provincial election, Manning also ran for the Social Credit Party and became one of the Social Credit Party MLAs. And he was actually brought into cabinet in 1935. At that time, he was only 27 years old. So when he became a cabinet minister, I think he was like Minister of Industry or something. He was at that point the youngest cabinet minister in the British parliamentary family since 1782. So it was very notable that Ernest Manning would be a cabinet minister that young. And of course, as I mentioned, when Aberhart died in 1943, the Social Credit Caucus made Manning the premier. So he took over the premiership of Alberta in 1943. He also took over the religious leadership of Aberhart's ministry, the radio program, and the Calgary Prophetic Bible Institute. So Manning became the main preacher for what was called then the National Back to the Bible Hour, and then as it later became known, Canada's National Bible Hour. So from that time forward, Manning, for his whole time as premier until 1968, and for more than 20 years afterwards, Manning was the main preacher for Canada's National Bible Hour. So Canadians, right across the country could hear Alberta's premier preaching on the radio. I mean, it's quite a unique thing, to think of having a man who's preaching the gospel on the radio weekly, and he's the premier of a province at the same time. So in those early years, every Saturday, a car would drive up to the Alberta legislature, and Manning would get in, and they'd drive to Calgary, and he'd hold services on the Sunday in the Calgary Prophetic Bible Institute and do the radio program, and then he'd be back in his office in Edmonton on Monday, as premier of the province. So that lasted a few years before, Manning was too busy, and they'd have to bring the program to Edmonton, and he'd do it from Edmonton. But for Manning, it was very important to maintain the ministry as well as being a premier. It wasn't just enough to be the premier. It was very important to him to get the gospel across the country. So also, after Manning became the main preacher for Canada's National Bible Hour, the program was extended right across Canada. Like, of course, when he took it over, it was mostly Alberta, but they began expanding further into BC and Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and by 1951, they were also into Ontario and the Maritimes. So saying here, one particular author said that by 1951, the program was being heard on 14 stations across Canada and claimed an audience of 1 million. So I mentioned you'd have people across Canada hearing Alberta's preacher weekly preach the gospel to them. Also, because of Manning's influence as a religious leader, he was able to convince some of the other premiers and Prime Minister Lester Pearson to sign a letter formally inviting Billy Graham to Canada for Billy Graham's first Canadian crusade. Now, in 1947, oil was discovered in a big way in Alberta, and that was obviously beneficial to Manning's government because it was a whole new source of revenue for him. But Manning was known to operate his government with much efficiency and honesty, and so the government ran, quite smoothly. And excuse me, there's a fly. But Alberta's government operated smoothly and efficiently under Manning, and the oil, of course, helped him to. The oil revenue helped with the various services that the Alberta government had to provide. Now, he resigned as premier in 1968. And I just want to read a quote here from Brian Brennan, his biographer, about what things were like, or what the situation was when Manning retired in 1968. It was said, it was noted at that time that Manning still believed in keeping the Christian Sabbath as a day of rest, despite public opinion to the contrary. He alienated young urban voters by refusing to let theaters show movies on Sundays and absented himself from the legislature when the House approved a measure permitting professional sports to be played on Sundays. So Manning still wanted, laws preventing theaters and sports on Lord's Day because he was a Christian, and he realized he was out of sync with the population. So when he resigned, he didn't have to deal with that anymore. But he was very well respected, like not just among Christians. You have to remember that Manning won every election he ran in, and he resigned as premier. He didn't lose an election, and he would usually win with landslide majority. So even, most of Alberta wasn't Christians necessarily. So a lot of the people that supported him were not Christians themselves, but even though they didn't share his religious views, they respected him because, he was seen to be a very serious person, a very conscientious person, and people respected that. So he remained very popular as premier right till the time he resigned. After he resigned, he was replaced by a man named Harry Strom, who was also Christian. I'll probably mention something about Harry Strom in a minute. But the Social Credit government remained in power until 1971, when Harry Strom was defeated by Premier Peter Lougheed. And Peter Lougheed's a more familiar name for many people. Now, after Manning resigned in 1970, he was appointed to the Canadian Senate by Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau. And this is peculiar. This is something that's still a bit of a mystery, because of course Pierre Trudeau was a liberal and left wing, and Ernest Manning was very conservative, and Pierre Trudeau was not popular in social credit circles. Nevertheless, Manning was appointed to the Senate, and the speculation, I'm just speculating, but the speculation was there was some discussion between the federal Liberal Party and the provincial Social Credit Party of trying to work together to defeat the Progressive Conservatives at that time. And so, like I say, this is speculation that Manning was appointed as a way of the federal Liberals to reach out to the Social Credit Party to see if there was some way they could cooperate against the Progressive Conservative Party. Anyway, when Manning retired, his name was so well respected in Alberta that in the 1980s, when Preston Manning started to create the Reform Party, the Manning name was gold in Alberta, and the reputation of the Manning family helped to get the Reform Party off the ground in Alberta, because so many people still knew of Manning and respected Ernest Manning, and that was kind of like a foundation for Preston Manning to help to build the Reform Party many years later. Now, one other aspect of Ernest Manning's legacy is the development of the oil sands. Like the oil sands here in Alberta, it was very difficult for them to find a way of getting the oil out of the sand. Beginning in the 1920s, there were many different attempts to develop the oil sands, and they all failed because they just didn't have the technology at the time. But Ernest Manning believed in the oil sands, and he believed that they could still be used. So he was searching for an investor who would develop the oil sands, and he eventually found a man named Howard Pugh. Howard Pugh was the president of Sun Oil in the United States. Now, one of the interesting things that's common between these two men is they're both evangelical Christians. Of course, Manning was known in Canada as the preacher for Canada's National Bible Hour, but Manning was also known to some degree in the United States because he did some speaking for Billy Graham, and he had written in early years for Billy Graham's magazine, Christianity Today. So he had a bit of a name in the United States. And Howard Pugh was a very big name in evangelical circles because as a wealthy man, he used his money to fund Christian causes in the United States. And he was for a little while known as God's bankroller because of his support for conservative causes in the United States. So they had this commonality, this religious bond between them, and that helped them to work together. And so in 1962, Howard Pugh committed $250 million to develop Alberta's oil sands, and those two men worked together. But what's interesting, though, is that even though they were friends and they worked together, Ernest Manning wanted the best deal for Alberta, of course, and Howard Pugh wanted the best deal for Sun Oil. And so there was competition between them, and they had some friction. But then they had a friend who would mediate between them. That friend was Billy Graham. They were both friends of Billy Graham. And so Billy Graham worked to help mediate the divisions between Ernest Manning and Howard Pugh so that the oil sands development could finally take place. So as I mentioned, Harry Strom replaced Ernest Manning when Ernest Manning retired. And one of Strom's first trips after becoming premier was to go to Washington, D.C. to hear Ernest Manning keynote Richard Nixon's presidential prayer breakfast. So after Manning resigned, he was a keynote speaker at Richard Nixon's presidential prayer breakfast in Washington, D.C. And Billy Graham and Howard Pugh were both at that meeting as well. So I just want to have one little word here about Harry Strom. So Aberhart and Manning are known as Alberta's fundamentalist premiers, but for 3 years after them, there was another social credit premier who I mentioned, Harry Strom. Now, I don't think Harry Strom necessarily referred to himself as a fundamentalist, but he was definitely an evangelical. And when he was running for leadership of the Social Credit Party in Alberta to take over Manning, of course, he had campaign brochures. And I just want to read a quote from one of Harry Strom's campaign brochures to give an idea of what kind of man he was. It says this: Harry Strom is an active Christian layman who believes that Christian principles are relevant and applicable to politics and public affairs. He has held executive and teaching positions within the Evangelical Free Church, and has long participated in the work of other Christian organizations and service groups. His personal faith will not be expressed in terms of inflexible positions on such matters as Sunday movies, Sunday hunting, or liquor regulations. He believes that these matters must be decided by plebiscites in accordance with the will of the majority. So, Harry Strom, I mean, this is 1968 when this is going on, and he thought it was advantageous to still explicitly promote his Christian beliefs in his campaign to become social credit leader. So there was still enough Christian influence in Alberta that this was a positive thing and not a negative thing. So I just want to talk a little bit about what I call Manning era Alberta. What was Alberta like in the Manning era in terms of its religious effect? What's interesting is in the 1950s, Alberta was seen to be so different within the Canadian context that the University of Toronto Press published a 10-volume series of books about Alberta to explain Alberta to the rest of the country. And this 10-volume series was called Social Credit in Alberta, Its Background and Development. Now, one of the volumes in that 10-volume series is this book here, Sect, Cult, and Church in Alberta, written by sociologist William Mann. So this book is from 1955. It's one of the 10-volume series. So it's to explain to Canadians why Alberta is different religiously from the rest of Canada, because Alberta was different in terms of the religious makeup, in terms of its evangelical influence, and also to some degree, Alberta has many more Mormons than the rest of Canada, because there was a big wave of Mormon immigration from the United States in the early 1900s. So William Mann saw Alberta as being very, very different from the rest of Canada religiously. And let me just quote a bit here from that book that really summarizes what's going on here. So this is what Mann says about Alberta. Alberta attracted attention not only by the variety of its religious groupings, but also by the influential role which sectarian religion had played in social and in political and social developments. In what other province of Canada had two successive premiers been active preachers and leaders in a fundamentalist evangelical movement? In what other province had the party in power maintained close and formal ties for, in 1947, 12 consecutive years with a small, little-known evangelical sect? The intimate and unbroken association of Alberta's Social Credit Party and its leaders with the fundamentalist Prophetic Bible Institute spoke clearly of extraordinary sectarian developments. Other religious trends had been almost as alarming. For instance, as amazing, not alarming. For instance, the non-denominational fundamentalist Bible school at Three Hills, Alberta, the Prairie Bible Institute, had in 1947 the largest daytime enrollment of any seminary or Bible school on the American continent. So in 1947, the Prairie Bible Institute, which I mentioned earlier, was the largest Bible college and seminary in North America, which is quite amazing that, for Alberta to have that kind of an institution. So Mann goes on to explain the disproportionate influence of Bible school graduates on churches in Alberta, and also the disproportionate amount of religious programming on Alberta's radios. There was more religious radio programming in Alberta than any other province. So Alberta was very distinctive religiously in the mid-20th century in these different ways. Now, not everybody was happy about this, of course. There were some left-wing people in Alberta who were not happy about the influence of Christianity and Alberta's government in particular. And there was during the 1960s, there was a journal published in Edmonton called Edge. It was edited by a University of Alberta English professor, and it published an article in 1964 by an American graduate student who was a sessional lecturer at the University of Alberta, which basically referred to Alberta as a theocracy. He mentioned that the social credit government was basically what he called entrenched in a monolithic system of theocracy. He said the differences between Alberta today and the Calvinistic theocracies in early American history are not easily discerned. And he claimed that evolution could not be taught in Alberta's public schools, which I don't think was true. Anyway, he made all kinds of claims about how much the Christians dominated Alberta government. And I don't think it's true. Like I think he's very much exaggerating the situation, but it does convey, how much how some people perceive the Alberta government and how much Christian influence there was, at least in the eyes of certain people. I still have a little bit of time here. So those are Alberta's two main Christian premiers, Aberhart and Manning, and of course, Strom, who came after them. But there was also Christian influence at the federal level, especially through Robert Thompson, who became leader of the Federal Social Credit Party. As I mentioned, at the time in 1935, the Federal Social Credit Party was formed, and it was very influential in Alberta. At least, when Diefenbaker became leader of the Progressive Conservative Party. He drained a lot of the social credit support away in Alberta, but nevertheless, there was still remained some federal social credit support until the 1960s. So there was a man named Robert Thompson from Central Alberta. During the 1930s, he came under the influence of Aberhart himself, and when Aberhart bought into social credit, Robert Thompson went and got trained by Aberhart. Like Aberhart saw Thompson's, potential, just like he saw Manning's potential, and he trained Thompson as one of his social credit speakers, and was very influential in Thompson's life, Robert Thompson. So Robert Thompson became one of the social credit organizers and speakers. Of course, when the war came along, Robert Thompson joined the military. He was sent to Ethiopia, and he helped with the Canadian military there. He became friends actually with the Emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie. So when the war ended, for a while, Thompson worked in the Ethiopian civil service. But in 1955, he left the Ethiopian civil service and began working with the Sudan Interior Mission as a missionary. And so he was there for a few years as a missionary. He came back to Alberta in 1958 and spoke on issues related to Africa in certain contexts. But then he decided to become leader of the Federal Social Credit Party, and Ernest Manning encouraged Robert Thompson to become leader of the Federal Social Credit Party. So he did that. I think he became leader in 1961. Then there was a federal election in 1962. And Robert Thompson was one of 30 social credit MPs elected in 1962. This is social credit party was never a dominant party federally, but 30 MPs is quite a lot. When you think about 1962, then they lost a couple years later. I think it was 1963. I had it here. There was another federal election. They lost 6 of their MPs, and there was 24 elected in 1963. They were down to 5 MPs in 1965. So their support did decline, but they were a bit of a presence, and that was back in the days of a minority government, conservative and then liberal minority government. So sometimes small parties can have more influence that way. Nevertheless, they did have that significant presence in the legislature. When he was a member of parliament, Robert Thompson was one of the founders of the National Prayer Breakfast. That was in 1964. And as my understanding is that National Prayer Breakfast is still happening every year in Ottawa now. But he was one of the main founders of it at that time. Now, as a federal social credit leader, he traveled across Canada to speak on social credit issues, but he also spoke on other kind of conservative issues. And a number of his speeches were put together into this book, which became a bestseller. Can I show? Yeah, here we go. Common Sense for Canadians. This sold over 40,000 copies in the 1960s. This is a bunch of his speeches compiled together as a book. And, at least one of his speeches, he's talking to the Ontario Sunday School Association, and he's promoting revival in Canada. He's saying how much Canada needs a spiritual revival for Canadians to turn back, to God. And so this is a major federal leader speaking this way. And I bought this book at a secondhand store, and just as a little aside, but within the book, someone had put as a bookmark, this is a campaign brochure from Robert Thompson from the 1965 federal election. At this time, he's the member of parliament for Red Deer. That's the city between Edmonton and Calgary. So he was a member of parliament there for a number of years. So actually, the Social Credit Party began to fall apart. And in 1968, he joined the Progressive Conservative Party. So his last term as a member of parliament from 1968 to 1972, he actually served as a progressive conservative. And after 1972, he actually went to teach political science at Trinity Western College, which is now Trinity Western University. So he died in 1997. So after the social credit era, the influence of Christianity as a political force in Alberta declined substantially, but it didn't go away altogether. There was kind of a gradual diminishing of the Christian influence. Actually, at this point, I want to introduce what I think is the best book on Alberta politics ever. It's called God's Province, Evangelical Christianity, Political Thought, and Conservatism in Alberta. This is actually an academic book. So at the time that Clark Bannock wrote this book, he was a professor at York University. He's actually from Alberta, and he's back in Alberta now. So this is actually, a sympathetic account of Alberta politics, but the focus is the influence of evangelical Christianity right from the early years of the province until contemporary times. And so if you ever get just one book on Alberta politics, I'd recommend this one most of all. It's a very interesting book. So he talks about, among the people I've talked about, he also talks about Ted Byfield and Alberta Report magazine. Now, Alberta Report magazine was founded in 1973 by Ted Byfield. Ted Byfield was actually originally from Ontario. He moved to Manitoba in the 1950s. He was a reporter for the Winnipeg Free Press. He won a National Press Award there. And while he was in Manitoba, he actually became a Christian, and he helped found a group called the Company of the Cross, which was dedicated to promoting Christianity through education and through media. So they founded a private school in Manitoba. Then he came to Alberta to found a private school here, the St. John's School in Alberta, which no longer exists. But from there, he founded Alberta Report magazine under a different name in 1973, and it existed until 2003. And that magazine was very influential in Alberta, had a very high circulation, and it was very influential among people. And so it's very important for the conservative movement in Alberta for many years. And Clark Bannock describes Ted Byfield's thinking and what he tried to do with Alberta Report in his particular book that I showed. And I just want to quote what Clark Bannock says about it here. He says, "The essence of Byfield's social thought, the message that most easily resonated with readers, was the notion that the vast majority of the ills of contemporary society, including crime, domestic abuse, family breakup, and even rampant government spending leading to chronic deficits, could be traced back to the declining influence of traditional Christian values, especially as they pertain to the norms governing sexual behavior." So Alberta Report was not like an overtly Christian magazine. It didn't have, they weren't like quoting Bible verses in the stories, but it was a news magazine with a Christian perspective, with a conservative perspective. And so with that magazine, Byfield and the other people that worked with him, they were trying to reestablish Christian morality as as the basis of Alberta society. So that was the kind of the perspective that the magazine operated from. Now, there's also last year, someone wrote a book, a biography of Ted Byfield, and I highly, highly recommend it. It's by Jonathan Van Maren. This is Prairie Lion, The Life and Times of Ted Byfield. You probably know, you might have heard of Jonathan Van Maren. He's actually in Ontario. He's a very prominent pro-life and Christian activist. He's a great guy, and this is an excellent book. If you ever buy just one biography of a Canadian, this is the book I recommend highly, because Ted Byfield is a very important person in Western Canada. I mean, he was one of the founders of the Reform Party. There's all kinds of things one could talk about with Ted Byfield in terms of the influence that he had. Also, I should mention Preston Manning. I'm sure you would have heard of the Reform Party. Preston Manning was the son of Ernest Manning. I mentioned earlier how the Manning name was so significant in Alberta. So when Preston tried to get the party off the ground, he immediately had support in Alberta. And now he was not as conservative as his father, and he wasn't as overt about it, the Christian influence, but he, of course, he is a Christian, and there was that background Christian influence when he was building the Reform Party and had the influence when he was the kind of perspective he was coming from as he was involved in politics was a basic Christian perspective. And I'll just two other things I'll just mention here. I'm just kind of wrapping up here. So that the political influence of Christianity has definitely been declining in Alberta in recent years, but there are two other important ways in which Christianity affected Alberta and therefore Canada. One is that it was primarily Albertans who spearheaded the legalization of Christian radio stations and TV stations in Canada. Like from the late 1920s, Canada adopted a policy where religious organizations could not have TV and religious stations. They could have programs where they purchased, TV or radio from secular stations, but they couldn't have their own specific radio and TV stations. And beginning in the 1970s, some people began to try and get, licenses for Christian stations, and it was forbidden by law. But there were, people in other parts of Canada, but especially in Alberta, who tried to get that law changed so that there could be Christian radio and TV. Like one of them here in Alberta is Alan Hunsberger. I don't know if you ever heard of him, but he spent many years trying to change the CRTC's regulations. And there were others too who in the 1980s started illegally broadcasting American Christian programs here in Alberta. And to make a long story short, their civil disobedience led to the CRTC ultimately to change its regulations. And so the first Christian radio station in Canada was launched in Calgary in 1994. And the first Christian TV station in Canada was launched in Lethbridge, the Miracle Channel, in 1996. So it was this kind of this influence, Christian influence in Alberta, led to changes in law that would kind of benefit other parts of Canada. Something similar in terms of the creation of the Homeschool Legal Defense Association in Canada. Like in the early 80s, when homeschooling went big in the United States, a couple of men there, Mike Ferris and Mike Smith, who are lawyers in the United States, who are homeschoolers, they created the Homeschool Legal Defense Association of the United States to advocate for homeschoolers, to defend them in courts and advocate for legislation to benefit homeschooling. So by around 1980, there were people in Canada who wanted that, and there was a group here in Alberta who started working with Mike Ferris to get that group established in Canada. So Homeschool Legal Defense Association of Canada was formed in Alberta in the early 1990s as a result of the influence of Christians here in Alberta. And of course, it's based in Ontario now, but it started out with its base in Alberta, where the people who first gathered together to create it was. So that's kind of another way in which Christian influence from Alberta helped to have a beneficial effect across Canada, if you will.